Hi, I am Faruk. I walk with a mic sometimes, and other times I do product design. I also do science fiction writing, and there are times that I do a variety of other things, but for the most part nowadays it's those two things plus being a conscientious objector to the Trump administration. That is not just a joke, that is literally an ethical stance to take. So, on the subject, welcome to a primer on ethical design practices. As Andy mentioned, I come from a background of front-end development and modernizers, a library for helping people understand what capabilities browsers have for doing everything that was coming up and brand new in CSS3, HTML5, new JavaScript. It was a way for developers to embrace the power of new technologies without basically sacrificing and leaving behind people using older browsers or older technologies. So in a sense, there was an ethical component to that, which was, hey, you can make cool stuff without like turning your back on a lot of people in the process, which, you know, is always a nice thing. I don't have any slides about that. I don't have any slides about the fact that I just came from the desert where I was for a couple of days. During which time it was a conference in the desert at a pool. So, you know, we weren't quite in camps and dehydrating, but there were some sessions on design and ethics there, and so I come back and I'm like, okay, I'm going to adjust my talk a little bit, I'm going to add some new thoughts, some great insights that came up, and then of course I see that there's like a lot more things that have been happening in the past week in the area of design and ethics in our industry, so my talk is a little less rehearsed and a little bit more improvised, which is great, because that's also something I do, except poorly. So, what are ethics? Basically, collectively agreed upon moral standards. There is a fine line of difference, and it's useful to have that difference kind of like clearly in your head, but morals are very personal, very subjective. It's the moral code that you live by for you as an individual. It's how you operate through life. Ethics are more structured and they are more institutionalized. We are, when we establish ethics, it's basically what we agree on collectively as a set of ethics. It's more rigid and it's more demanding, and morals are more personal and fluid, and they are, well, you know, you can violate them a lot easier than generally speaking with ethics. There is an easy, handy way of kind of thinking about them, institutionalized versus personal. The institutionalized nature of ethics suggests, I have it in parentheses because it's not inherently true, of course, but it suggests that they're more objective, whereas the personal morals are a little bit more subjective, and they certainly are more fluid and differ a lot more from person to person and from area to area. Now, codes of ethics are essentially the codification of a set of ethics into something for a specific purpose. And the reason we do that is the very same reason we have laws in society. It is to protect us from harm. Laws, of course, they help protect us against more universal dangers or more universal threats. And by universal, I mean in that the dangers and the threats from laws, the violator or the victim of them is more likely, or can be anyone. It's not limited to a specific subset of people. There are laws, of course, that protect a certain subset of people against specific threats that they face that other groups or members of other groups do not face. But generally speaking, laws are more universal in that sense. Whereas a code of ethics is often more specific and more tailored to something like, say, a field of discipline or an industry. And that comes with another similarity in that when you violate a law, you have to pay fines, or you might have to leave public society, you have to go to jail, depending on the severity of your crime. If you violate a code of ethics, kind of the worst thing that can possibly happen is that you have to leave your field. You might also be violating laws, and then there's punitive measures in those cases, of course, but if you violate your code of ethics from your industry or your company or whatever it might be, not exactly a very serious infraction comparatively. There's Generally, a code of ethics usually doesn't have, it's more of a toothless version of a law. It doesn't really have the same bite and threat to you if you violate it. And the strength and quality of a society is measured by how well it protects all individuals from harm. Now, this is something I like because it also allows us to replicate this for what codes of ethics are about, and we can say the strength and quality of a industry or field of discipline is measured by how well it protects all individuals, meaning the members of that industry, as well as the customers of that industry from harm. So it's a little bit more specific when we talk about code of ethics, but this is a good metric that applies similarly. Now, earlier I was mentioning how ethics are essentially a rigid set of morals, and this is where we get into programming AI, because ultimately what morals help us do is make judgment calls. It's all about should I do this or not? And of course, should I do this or not is a question that we are increasingly asking machines to do for us because, well, we have the technology, why shouldn't we do that, right? There are, however, some caveats about that, and ethics start to play an increasingly influential and important role in that. So when we talk about programming AI or programming machines to make judgment calls, there's this, I want to say funny, but it's not really funny, logical fallacy that people always apply. Because, why would you program an AI to make human decisions or human judgment calls? The answer is, because humans are biased. Who programs the AI? The biased humans. So really what we're doing is absolving ourselves from direct responsibility to indirect responsibility, and we're not actually doing anything better if this is the extent of it, but of course it's not. There's more to it. That said, it is a dangerous misconception to believe that machines are more objective than humans, and especially to say that they are inherently more objective than humans. Now, when we make a judgment call, there's a lot that comes around to it. So in society, we have created ethical dilemmas for a really long time to help us refine our sense of making judgment calls. And as I said before, I'm also a science fiction writer, so I'm a big fan of science fiction. And one example of a piece of science fiction about ethical dilemmas is a highly popular cult classic film, critically acclaimed, still widely beloved. I am talking, of course, about I, Robot. There should be more laughter because the movie's not that great. It's an okay movie, but it does a pretty good job at posing the ethical dilemma of can machines make more human decisions than humans do, or can they make more effective or objective decisions than humans do? iRobot has it tends to poeticize that ethical dilemma to something simpler, focus more on the technology. Can machines make art? Or can machines have heart? And its method for doing so is, of course, the whole save the girl problem of the robot saving one human life, and the one it decides to save is the one with the slightly higher percentage of likelihood to survive the problem that they're in, whereas the other life is a young girl who has a much longer and potentially more valuable life ahead of her than the one with the higher likelihood to survive, and the machine ergo makes the wrong decision. Well, but is it the wrong decision? Big question. There's a couple of things about that, and what I like about, the short story based on the film itself or the ethical dilemma is it's kind of timeless in a lot of ways, because ultimately it comes down to a mathematical equation. These judgments are just mathematical equations where we have a bunch of variables and we weigh them against one another and we make a decision based on that. And that is what ethical dilemmas actually are all about in a lot of ways. Now, machines are kind of bad at morals or ethics because morals are derived from many variables. When we as humans make a decision along these lines, whether it's saving a life or something much less severe, we make those decisions based on countless numbers of variables in our very rapid brain equations that are informed by our lived experiences, our teachings from a young age to adults, our personal convictions, our experiences, our insights, things that how we understand the world to work, but also things like our biases and specifically a lot of our unconscious biases. And when we delegate such responsibilities to machines to make those decisions for us, it requires us to kind of replicate all of those variables into the machine for that same mathematical equation. And it turns out like that's not really a thing that we do remotely adequately because there are so many of them. We do not condense the entirety of a human lived experience into a set of variables and tell the AI, hey, these are the things you need to consider, let alone do that for hundreds or thousands of humans at the same time. And that's how a lot of this stuff works. And priming these machines for decisions is necessary and can be perfectly fine. It's not an inherent problem there. It really depends on what you use it for, such as naming guinea pigs. Now, if you teach an AI to name guinea pigs, you have to prime it with some variables as well, and then let it do its thing. It starts to think about what guinea pigs sound like, and I love this quote from the researcher behind it. It's like, I'm a big fan of Fuffbee and Fuzzable and Snifkin, particularly because they're so quintessentially guinea pig. Very accurate. I love how this machine, this robot, totally figured out, oh yeah, this is a guinea pig name, as opposed to this is a bundle of letters that I'm spitting out. Now, when if you're buying a guinea pig for a child or for a family member or whoever as a little gift, not so much a problem you need to solve. But if you have to, say, name thousands and thousands of guinea pigs on a weekly basis because you are at some kind of center where they transmit or deal with so many of them, it's useful to have a machine take care of that work for you. So there are totally great applications of AI, and naming guinea pigs is one of them. Making an AI or teaching an AI to generate and compose music, really cool, I love it. But, there are more things we can do about that. AI is great when we're solving problems of inconvenience. What about solving problems where human lives hang in the balance? That's something where there's a lot more risks and concerns involved that we have a tendency to overlook a lot. Not like fully, it's not like we're going like, oh, well, we're gonna now use this AI that is capable of generating guinea pig names and have them decide who gets to come into the country. That would be a weird visa process. Speaking as someone who's gone through that. Not with guinea pig names, thank God, but awkward. I'm looking at my phone, like slowly inching its way and then stopping and then inching its way, going down. So, okay. So, it's fine. No, it's fine. Like I said, not very well rehearsed. It's a first time giving this talk, and it's post 4 days in the desert in the heat, so we're doing great, everyone. It's cool. So AI and algorithms, they're very powerful, especially when we apply them to large human-scale problems. And the concern and the risk and seriously the problem with that is that instead of really solving problems, they have a tendency to magnify systemic biases. I don't know if everyone's seen this or is familiar with it, but a couple years ago, ProPublica did an investigation into predictive risk analysis algorithms and AIs that were taking new arrested people and determining whether or not they would have a high risk factor for future offenses, future violations of the law. And There's this example of Vernon Prater, who was a low-risk. Vernon he shoplifted some goods from a lobby or from like a Lowe's or something like that, I don't know. He stole about $86 worth of goods from a shop. And Brisha Borden stole with her friends, she and her friends briefly, for like less than a minute, stole a child's bike and a scooter. And then they were called out by the mom and they left them behind again and they ran off and they were like, okay, no, well, we didn't really want to take them. Or maybe they did, but they were like, this is not useful for us, this is too small. But they briefly stole them for about, 30 seconds or so. Both were arrested. Oh, and the value of the scooter and the bike was like $80. So very similar offenses in terms of like valuation. They both had 3 prior offenses. Brisha, high risk, 8. Vernon Prater, low risk, 3. Turns out, however, Vernon Prater's prior offenses were 2 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery, and he served 5 years in jail before that shoplifting. Brisha has 3 other juvenile misdemeanors that were all really quite benign. Turns out, of course, Vernon did a grand theft after that and served additional years in jail, and Brisha has not done any subsequent offenses at all. And the discovery was that the algorithm or the AI was relying on a lot of like systemic bias-driven statistics in society that made a black person a high risk for subsequent offenses, and a white male with a somewhat violent criminal record and having to spend time in jail already, probably fine. There are other factors as well, like age and condensation of crime rate, but they discovered in this report that they did over the course of some time and looking at a lot of these cases. And this is an AI system that is used like in a lot of places. They discovered a very strong systemic bias against black people being magnified by this AI effectively. So, as I said, science fiction, big fan. You might know where I'm going with this. Predicting future crimes? What? That's literally the plot of Minority Report. And that is, of course, an allegory on the perils of premature optimization. That's the entirety of that movie, really. It's just about like premature optimization, and it's a bad thing, don't do it. Now, there are important things to optimize for before things go wrong. That is absolutely a good thing. What we should totally optimize for is our biases from ourselves and our society leaking into the algorithms and the AI that we program, and make sure that we catch them before we set those AIs to work. That is not the kind of premature optimization that anyone is doing. Well, I mean, some people are doing a little bit of that, but it's not like the main thing. Instead, we are prematurely optimizing completely different problems, sort of. Ultimately, the reason for programming these judgment calls or relegating judgment calls to machines and to AI is that this is a valid argument to make for it. It's easier to combat biases in one programmer than it is in doing it in 10 or hundreds or thousands of individuals who have to do the same task as that one single AI has to do. You can easily imagine, 5,000 people who all have to make a risk analysis based on an offender from some kind of crime and go like, well, this person might make another or commit another crime in the future. 10,000 people doing that for many people every day. It's hard to make sure that all 10,000 have the same moral compass and understanding of all of the knowledge out there about like whether or not that person will actually commit another crime in the future. So there's a valid argument to this whole process. It is easier to combat biases in just a small set of programmers, for instance, than it is to do so in a large group of people who have to make those same judgment calls. But when we say easier, we are really just talking about easier than incredibly hard, which is still very, very hard. A big part of that is because we are humans, and overcoming our biases is something we are actually notoriously bad at. And there's a reason for it. We love our biases. We like to call them convictions. We like to call them things that we believe in and understand to be true. But sometimes they're not actually true, or they're incorrect, or they're flawed, and they're actually biases. And it's really hard to suss out which one is which. We build our entire lives around the convictions that we have because they help us through life. They help us navigate the system, and they give us the framework by which we operate most of our lives every day, day in and day out. But let's think a little bit bigger. What about an AI to help you hire better candidates? That sounds pretty great, right? Hiring people. Who has had like a hand in hiring people? Okay. Who has had a hand in like interviewing candidates? Okay, almost everyone. So interviewing and hiring people is not a great process. It's not an easy process, and usually you have like, if you're just interviewing people, you have like maybe 45 minutes to an hour most of the time to spend with that person, and then you have to make this massive judgment call out of that 1 hour to say like whether or not, yeah, I give you this person the thumbs up to go and hire them, or maybe not, or maybe. That sounds like a cool problem to solve with AI, software that can do this really fast and look at all these aspects of what a candidate might be good at, what they can do, their talent, skills, who knows. Sounds pretty great to me. What about an AI that predicts that you might become pregnant? Could be useful. If you're a person with a uterus and you are open to being pregnant, then that's something that you might do when it happens, and you might decide to keep it, and that's great. And there are a lot of predictable symptoms towards that. Like even shops can now determine, based on your buying preferences and behaviors, whether or not you're likely to be pregnant or become pregnant. And what about an AI that determines your likelihood for illnesses? I'm personally someone who has a sort of like a natural lean towards depression. That's something I have to actively take care of, and an AI could be programmed to identify something like that and then help alert me ahead of time, like, hey, you might be slipping towards a depression again, so you should do something about that. What about an AI that steers your political leanings by maybe changing your Facebook post or algorithms of what you see there? There's a lot of power that we are about to, or are already giving these AI routines, essentially, that can affect us. But it becomes a lot more of a problem if we start to combine an AI or AIs like these with that hiring AI who decides to use some of the results of these other AIs as ingredients for its algorithms to determine whether or not this candidate should be even bothered to be brought in for an interview, or, oh, you're a small company and you don't have the capacity to offer maternity leave, you don't have the size to have to do it legally, so this person, they might become pregnant in the next year, so you should probably not even bother interviewing with them. This is a legitimate problem that can happen, and what this kind of will lead to is really just greater homogeneity, and those in turn lead to worse performance and outcomes. Now, this is the product team at Twitter, which is exactly the kind of team I would expect an AI to produce. This is the top talent, you guys. I mean, look at them. They know how to choose between two types of shirts, a white shirt or a plaid shirt. This is Jack, he's just a CEO, he doesn't count. They know how to choose between two types of shorts. Shorts or jeans? Just for the sake of diversity, because it is important. There is one Asian man, and that's top talent, you guys. It's top talent. If you told me this is the outcome of an AI determining who is the best person for the job, I would be like, yeah, that makes sense. That's totally what I would expect. Which probably just means Jack is really good at thinking like a machine. which is something he kind of like likes to pride himself on, in that he's like a machine who operates all the time, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, we can tell. It's a poorly configured machine. Now, you might wonder, it's like, okay, well, who cares? I mean, like, there's reason to care, but okay, so let's say you say, who cares, right? Turnover, kind of an important thing. The hiring problem is a pretty serious problem, but a more serious problem is the fact that in the technology industry alone, unethical or less ethical environments actually drive a really large portion of people to leave jobs or to leave the industry altogether. It is essentially, it's grouped as unfairness-based turnover. And the cost of hiring and finding and hiring replacements for the people who are leaving the technology industry, in whether it's design or development or back-end engineering, whatever, that's a $16 billion a year problem. And that is the conservative estimate, so it's probably a lot higher than that. And this is an ethical problem because it is situations of lower ethical environments or unethical environments that is driving these people out. And so even if you are someone who only looks at the financial picture or only looks at cost and not really at the human cost or the human psychology of things, or like whether you look like a terrible company because your entire leadership is just white dudes, there's the very real monetary problem as well. It's a really dumb problem to create. And we are creating it by using poorly trained AI or insufficiently trained AI, and we're causing it by not having very strong ethical standards in our industry or at our companies, or both, really. So the real problem that this actually all boils down to is our fantastic human ingenuity and capability to avoid doing the uncomfortable work of actually dealing with uncomfortable stuff. It can be really hard to overcome biases. It can be really hard to confront your own personal biases. And so we are a naturally clever and ingenious species. If there's something we don't like doing, we will think about a solution to navigate around that minefield and go like, see, I went from A to B. I didn't navigate the minefield itself. I built a machine that helps me fly over it. Or I made a car and it allowed me to drive all the way around it and still get there. Human ingenuity is an awesome thing. It's why we're all here in the basement of a building that is actually not crashing down on us. And, it's pretty cool. I have a microphone. It's magnifying sound waves. Human ingenuity is awesome, but we're also very good at applying it so magnificently at scale that we, in turn, create new problems with it. And that's where we get back to ethics again, because ethics is a duty of care. It is something that helps us provide a framework and a roadmap, basically, that helps us navigate this minefield of uncomfortable work that we have to do from time to time. And it tells us how to navigate that in ways that is easier, that has less side effects or causes fewer problems on the side, that explodes fewer minds around us. This is where ethics is really important. It's a duty of care. It's for ourselves, but it's also for the people around us and the people we work for and make products for. Now, our industry is really, really young, and I like to think of almost everything in sort of like orders of magnitudes of life cycles. So there's the human life cycle, then there's the larger scale life cycle of, say, a country. United States is very much in its adolescent phase. It's starting to learn that it needs to grow up. Doesn't really want to do it yet. Our industry is about 35 years old, really, like on an average take. It's, for an industry, it's also really young. It's basically still teenage years, starting to get into that adolescent phase and starting to learn like, oh man, I have to clean my own room myself now? This sucks. Our industry is still young. We're growing fast. We're becoming extremely influential, but we're also very naive when it comes to a lot of things. We are exceptional in that sense, but not in a good way. we don't have a code of ethics really for our industry. We don't have a licensing system. We don't have a Hippocratic oath for designers or software developers. But we are kind of exceptional in that we are one of the very few massively influential industries in the entire world that doesn't have that. Researchers have it, industrial designers have it, doctors, physicians, nurses. Literally every engineering discipline in the world except for software engineers have codes of ethics. Journalists have them, and which we don't. But our products are actually way more influential than most of those other products. They're just a little bit more indirect, you know. If you are building a building and you don't do it according to code and you operate with a lower ethical standard or an unethical standard, the building might collapse, kill people. That sucks. Our work, probably not going to collapse any buildings. We might just collapse a society by electing a terrible person. But it's not just that, it's everywhere. The products we make have an incredibly influential impact on human psychology, on human society, and we don't have actually any good code of ethics governing that, which is really bad. We're at the point now that we're applying AI technology and AI concepts to way more things, making them way more influential still, and scaling our solutions, our products to even larger audiences. And we are still not really doing a great job at looking at the biases that we are putting into these AIs, not intentionally, but because we are bad at doing that uncomfortable work of navigating that minefield ourselves that allows us to remove the biases before we create these AIs. We are really bad. Pirates had a code of ethics. Pirates had the brethren code that they lived by, not all of them, but most of them, and they lived by it pretty strictly. If you violate it, you die. Like, hey, I'm a pirate, I rob people for a living. Okay, that's fine. You rob another pirate, you die. So pirates had a code of ethics that they lived by and abided by for the most part that designers and software developers don't. That's kind of bad. Don't wait until it's too late, which is also true for writing apologies, or making apologies, rather. So I'm going to gloss over whether or not everyone is familiar with what's going on, but basically, recent times, a number of VCs have had to admit that they sexually assault and or harass women in the industry, and almost overwhelmingly women who come to them requesting funding. So there's, on top of being just like a crime and terrible and like unethical behavior in the first place, it is also a terrible power dynamic that they are exploiting and taking advantage of. And this is a crisis of ethics in our industry right now, and that's why I'm hoping that this will be our Challenger moment. The Challenger being, of course, the space shuttle that exploded and which triggered a massive investigation into why there were so many ethical failures in this entire operation. Because what turned out to be the case, there were plenty of people, basically whistleblowers, alerting, saying, hey, this is not going to work. This thing is going to blow up. This is not good. We're not doing a good job here. We need to like push back this launch. We need to do X, Y, and Z. And all of those concerns were just sort of overlooked and not listened to, and people were kind of like covering it up for one another. And it exploded. People died, and it was terrible. So these people did not kill anyone, which is good that we know of, who knows. But I'm hoping that this is kind of our Challenger moment in the industry, where we are now going to take a very serious and very hard look at these ethical concerns that we have been creating for a long time and haven't really addressed. So there's a similar thing to codes of ethics that was kind of contentious, and that's the code of conduct. 5 years ago, super controversial thing. Today, it's basically every event has one, every conference has one, lots of companies in our industry have one, but 5 years ago, man, so not good. I was kind of at the forefront of arguing for codes of conduct at events and conferences, and constantly calling out organizers like, hey, please add a code of conduct to your event. And they were usually just saying like, nah, we don't need that. Just don't be a dick, man. I've heard that argument so many times, and it turns out there's a lot of men out there that think don't be a dick is a good rule. I will just go and sexually harass women instead. Connection? Yeah, we have to spell this stuff out for people. We have to make it very explicit and very actionable before the people who are more or a little bit more fluid with their moral compass will start to listen to it. And we have to create actual like countermeasures if you violate them. So 5 years ago, code of conduct, rare thing to see in our industry. Not in other industries. Once again, we're exceptional. Other industries, all the time, codes of conduct everywhere. There are malls that had codes of conduct years ago, and people in our industry were like, nah, we don't need one. Now they're commonplace, which is a great thing, and it happened through, well, things going wrong, conferences getting canceled, people getting harassed, unfortunately, and we started taking this problem seriously. So what would it look like to actually create a code of ethics for design and technology? When the code of conduct problem happened, there were organizations that stepped up and started offering codes of conduct templates and frameworks to help you make one and add one to your event. They started offering workshops to teach you what it meant to actually have one and abide by it and to keep it actually relevant, because it's one thing to plaster a code of conduct on your website for your event and be like, this is our code of conduct, you guys. It's another thing to actually like actively enforce it and to know how to enforce it, to know what to do with violators, to know what to do when things go wrong. What do you do to actually like help mitigate problems around this? So there were organizations that stepped up, and they were not companies, they were not for-profit, they were just volunteers for the most part and some nonprofit organizations. So what would it look like to do the same thing for a code of ethics for our industry? Well, for one, it means actually getting to work with all of these, well, not all, but like most of these organizations that are already doing a lot of this work. There's tons of organizations that are already involved and have been spending a lot of time solving some of these problems, taking care of some of these concerns, and doing advocacy and giving advice and offering workshops and trainings. If we were to create a code of ethics for our industry, the first step would be we start talking to all of these organizations and work together to produce something that everyone can stand behind. Because this cannot be a singular effort that creates another logo on this slide when everyone else is like, who are you? What? It means that we have to learn from precedent. Like I said, we're not pioneers here. We're in fact kind of Luddites. We're the only majorly influential industry that doesn't have a code of ethics for it. This is from the SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists. There are 4 key principles to their code of ethics. With each of them has a bunch of actionable items grouped within them, but these are the main key categories, and they are really useful. They're focused on journalism and reporting, so they're not like one-to-one relevant for our field, but there's actually they're very good principles to get started with and say, hey, where do we start making or writing a new code of ethics? How about this one? And start adjusting it to actually cater to our specific professional needs. So we have to look at the precedent from other codes of conduct and learn from them. It has to be actionable and constructive. That's something that is really hard to do, especially when it comes to stuff like this. Codes of conduct had a similar thing. Don't be a dick was not actionable and constructive. It was just kind of a condemnation of any behavior that you personally deem to be dickish. So a good code of ethics for our industry would be actionable and constructive, and we also have to use positive and aspirational language. We're not out here to start accusing everyone of being unethical because you didn't do it exactly as the letter of this code of ethics. It's more about saying, hey, minimize harm, right? It's about saying, do it this way and it's better and it helps you and helps others. It's easier for you, etc., blah, blah, blah. once again, ethics, it's a framework to operate by. It's how we are going to be much more able to navigate that minefield of uncomfortable work that lies ahead of us and go through it without creating solutions and workarounds to get to the other side, ignoring all of the hard work that we need to do. Because if we have that roadmap to help us through it, that's what a code of ethics is, then we can actually go and do it and confront these biases and solve these problems. And it gives us constraints in our thinking that when we create solutions or think of solutions, it means that we realize right then and there, oh, you know, this is a possible solution, but it will create a side effect that it causes harm to these other people. There are other additional ways that we can learn more or understand ethical principles, and they are things like researching intersectional feminism and socialism and psychology and human-computer interactions, because all of these are they're not ethical research topics. They're not technology research topics, but they are all studies into the field of people and impacts on people. And specifically, they help give us more of those constraints that help us understand, oh, if I create a solution like this, it works for my use case that I had created there, and it's awesome, it does a really good job at that, but I am having this side effect of causing a huge amount of damage to other people. And the more we research these additional aspects for our inspiration, the stronger we develop a sense of ethics for ourselves and have a better understanding of it. So with that, I want to say thank you and go out and research and confront your biases. Thanks. And we might have time for questions. I don't know. Andy?
Maybe one.
Oh, maybe one. Ethical conundrum. Who is going to ask the question? I see a question here at the front. Hold on. Oh, yeah. I'll just repeat it.
Okay, what happens when a journalist breaks a code in the ethics?
So the question is, what happens if a journalist breaks a code from the code of ethics, and what would I recommend, right? So, like I said earlier on, codes of ethics are a little toothless. They don't really have enforcement structures. There's usually no body behind them that can enforce them. A code of ethics is more aspirational than it is a law. There's no way to say, like, okay, well, you violated this, now here's the punishment. Even with the Hippocratic Oath, like, it was designed and originally conceived to be, if you violate the Hippocratic Oath, you lose your license, you cannot be a doctor or a nurse anymore. Even now, that's not necessarily the case, in part because there is a huge amount of nuance to literally everything that involves humans. And so it's hard to just have kind of like zero tolerance policies and absolute rules, and certainly like absolute forms of punishment over rules. I think the same is true here. In terms of journalism, journalists violate codes of ethics all the time. Part of it is there's no real proper licensing for journalists either, and so anyone can call themselves a journalist just by having a website where they publish. Can be a terrible, shitty website that publishes almost never a single true word, and you can still call yourself a journalist, but literally everything you write is a violation of ethics. Turns out there's not much we can do about that anymore. We have to come up with solutions as a society against that sort of exploitative behavior and those exploitative vectors of abuse, really, that are being used by some people. When it comes to sort of like other measures, there are things we can do. Certainly for us, but even for the press, we can shine a spotlight on violators. And when we do that, and we do that well enough, we can get these violators out of their positions of power, which is what we're seeing with the VCs from earlier. There were 3 incredibly powerful men, and they did a bunch of really terrible things, and now they are not so powerful anymore. And that is the same kind of thing. But if we have a code of ethics, it's a lot easier for us to shine a spotlight. It also creates a framework for people who are victimized to be, hey, this is a violation, and then to step to an organization behind that code of ethics and say like, hey, I know of someone who's violating this. So it creates protections in that sense. The way laws create protections against harm, code of ethics create protections against harm in an industry. Do you have time for one more, or no? No, okay. Thank you all very much.